the directors' meeting, so I think you have a very receptive audience right here.
Great, wonderful. Are you wanting me to go ahead and start then?
Sure.
Okay, great. And if someone else comes in, that's fine, because like I said, Angie made you paper copies, but I had also brought them for you. And now this is, I'll just introduce myself really quickly. My name is Kathy Ermacher, and I am currently serving as the chair of the Mayor's Commission on Women. And I also am the president of the Women's Foundation. And this is Lindy Christensen Nader, who is here to be with us today. She is also a commissioner and on the foundation. We are talking about the Women's Voices Survey Project. This is something that we sort of recreated 10 years ago when we had looked at, there was a Women's Commission survey that had been done many years before that, and we recreated about 10 years ago. Lindy was working on her doctorate for sociology, and she took over the project and helping us to recreate the survey so that it would look much the same and have a lot of the same kinds of questions, but would also add questions that seemed to be more appropriate for today's times. Since then, we did another survey about 5 years ago, and so this is the one that we have just recently completed that was finished at the end of 2018. And what we did is we went to survey all different kinds of women from all different backgrounds and circumstances in Lincoln and Lancaster County. And as you'll notice on the front of the survey, we use a Native American proverb that says it takes 1,000 voices to tell a single story. And our objective was to get over 1,000 voices of women in Lincoln and Lancaster County, and we accomplished that by quite a bit. What we did then is we sent it out on social media, and there were lots of people who took it electronically, but we also knew that there would have to be groups of people in the community that we would need to reach where they were. So we went to community festivals and fairs like Juneteenth and Streets Alive and the Lunar New Year celebration. We went to agencies around town like the El Centro and the Center for People in Need, those kinds of places where we got them to respond to the survey as well. We went to women's organizations, AAUW, PEO chapters, anywhere and any place that we could find women who were interested in serving or giving us this information. And of course, it was totally confidential. The only thing we did ask them to do was to give us their zip code. And we did that because we wanted to be able to track that, but also because we had to be sure that they were in Lincoln or Lancaster County. So we did that. And the results we published in a format very similar to what it had been looking like 5 years ago. And the reason we wanted to do that was to show you're kind of comparing apples to apples then, and we wanted to be able to look and make some comparisons on the things that were most important. So if you look at the survey, the ranking of the issues, you'll notice that the issues turned out to be number 1, healthcare, number 2, employment, and number 3, basic needs. Those were the same 3 top categories that we had had 5 years previously. The numbers are a little different, but for the most part, those remained the top 3 issues. Within those issues, healthcare, always the cost. The cost of healthcare is always the main issue. And for many women who are trying to provide for themselves and their family, the cost of healthcare, and the other issue was accessibility. And particularly, we noticed this time, and because every woman is able at the end of the survey to make comments, we compiled all those comments, and we have every single comment that was given by any woman, and we have organized them. Lindy is our data master. She is golden. Many of the comments related to health this time were much more in the sexual reproductive area. And so we had a lot of more concerns about women's access to sexual reproduction services and the costs of those. This time we were interested that violence and discrimination were much higher than they had been before. And so that's a real concern for us. In the area of education, it is cost and sometimes cultural appropriateness, but violence, particularly sexual violence and violence against women and discrimination, particularly in the workplace and racial discrimination, surfaced as being one of the bigger concerns, and that was an area in which there was an uptick, and we were really concerned about that. I'm going to have Lindy talk about a couple of the other areas that we noticed and some differences that we saw this time. And obviously, you can look at the information yourself and see what you think is important, and we can certainly answer questions when she's done. But I'm going to ask Lindy to talk about a few
Yeah.
of her findings.
Some of the, and Kathy had mentioned previously that one of the demographic categories that we asked about was zip code. One of the things I'm working on this summer is compiling geographic profiles of the respondents, because I do already have reports put together by age and by race, ethnicity, and by educational attainment and that kind of stuff, and now I'm working on zip codes. So I am guessing that would be of particular interest to the city council, so you can see, you know, in this quadrant of the city or in this quadrant, what are women reporting as being most key. When it comes to healthcare, to go back to looking at some of the issues, one of the things that we saw, in addition to, you know, Kathy mentioning that there's a great concern regarding access to reproductive healthcare, there was a jump from the 2012 to the 2018 version in terms of mental health care services. And we also saw something that, you know, 6% of our sample cited substance abuse as being a primary concern. But within that area of substance abuse, what was bigger this time around was being affected by the substance addiction of family members or friends or something like that. So it seemed like there was some overlap there in connection to substance addiction, mental health outreach, that kind of stuff. So those certainly were bigger issues in this round in 2017, 2018. When we look at the piece related to employment, one of the, you know, as Kathy mentioned, we wanted to have some consistency from the survey that was offered in the 90s to what we did in 2011 to what we did again in 2018. But one of the things that stood out in our 2012 qualitative responses were women mentioning that they didn't feel like they had job opportunities that matched their experience or their degrees. And so we included that as a measure in 2018 to get a better understanding about that. But we were also learning from different organizations that we were partnering with that there were concerns for women who had a criminal justice record and difficulties getting opportunities for employment or getting access to services related to food or housing, educational opportunities. And so we added that measure of hiring difficulties related to criminal justice record, and 6% of our sample cited that as being,
Just really quickly. I want to mention too that, and some of you I'm sure you probably know this, we looked at educational attainment, and if you look at the state of Nebraska and then you look at Lincoln Lancaster County, the educational attainment of women in our area, in our city, in our county is higher in lots of cases than it is in the other parts of the state. And we also know that unemployment numbers are, you know, good. I mean, people would say, hey, we've got people hired. But what we also found for women particularly is that they are, like Lindy said, underemployed. They have degrees that are way past what the kind of jobs are that they're actually performing, and they're not being able to find jobs in the areas in which they have training or education. The other thing is, though, that so many responses were, I have to have 2 or 3 jobs. I'm putting together 2 or 3 jobs to be able to support myself and my family. The other thing that's important in this area is that if you look at families that have a 2-income household and then a single parent household, the statistics and the average income of the family are staggering. We're looking at almost sometimes up to $50,000 difference in a family where there's a double 2-parent household, where they have a double income and a single income. And we also know that many of those single parents are women. And so there is a big difference there, and that's why we think the basic needs area is one that comes up as high, is because many women are struggling with how do you pay utilities, how do you pay for food. And if you look at the difference in food costs from what it was 5 to 6 years ago and what it is now, and yet wages have stayed very stagnant, that is another comment that has been coming up a lot for us.
yeah, just over a third of the sample said cost of food was a primary concern within basic needs. And as Kathy mentioned, related to education, our sample is highly educated, very much employed, but still that those pieces of basic needs are continuing to be a concern.
Right.
Would you go back to scroll to your left,
Yes.
a bunch more, and I'm gonna go back to the lack of experience, lack of work matching
Experience.
That's 25%, 1 in
Yes.
4?
Reported that their job, the job that they currently held, did not meet their degree or the level of experience they had in the field.
And when we entered the data, because Lindy and I both entered the data, when you're entering the data and someone says, you know, one of the questions was, what do you have a degree in? What's your education? And someone would say things like, I don't know, healthcare worker or something
human
like that, or
services or
human
something, yeah.
services. And then when you look down and they're working as a waitress, that's the that's the difference there. And so, and then having to put 2 or 3 of those jobs together to be able to make ends meet. So, so that's true. And the other thing that I want to mention within the whole basic needs area is that we have a lot of elderly women, and we did try to get a very good sampling of all of the different age levels of the people in the community. And we have many, many women, elderly women, who are living in poverty. And they are people who worked when they didn't either work or they did work, but they worked in very low paying jobs. And so consequently, their Social Security is very low. And then we have elderly women who did not prepare for retirement because that wasn't something they really had at a position that they had. They didn't really have retirement plans. And so I think sometimes we think of poverty as being younger people sometimes in our community or younger mothers, but we have a lot of elderly women who have real serious poverty issues as well.
And
Did you
that's
wanna talk
something
about
in our, the reports by age groups really stands out. That's a way that we're able to really see, like, okay, women 19 to 29, what are they experiencing? What are women 70 plus experiencing? And that's been really informative for us, because the purpose of doing this survey is to inform us in terms of the programming that we try to do in the community, the partnerships that we try to cultivate. As Kathy mentioned, we do a lot of work with Center for People in Need, but one of the pieces, as Kathy just said, related to violence, we do a lot of partnering with Voices of Hope. And violence was, I think it was 5 or 6 in 2012, and this time it jumped up to number 4. And speaking with advocates and people who work at Voices of Hope, they've also seen an increase in outreach to their services, to their hotline, to people attending groups, to doing that kind of stuff. And they, when they're kind of theorizing, when the advocates are kind of theorizing what could be explaining that, they don't necessarily think that it's that violence is occurring at a greater rate now. They think that people are more willing to come forward and seek resources and disclose that they've survived violence or that they know people who have something like that. And so violence, some of the forms that stood out in our measurement were related to emotional and psychological abuse. And as Kathy said, we give people opportunities to provide more comments or to give greater detail. And some of what women were reporting were things related to isolation, control of finances, and work experiences. So the types of violence that tend to be more hidden. And that we also see law enforcement not always having as clear of a way to know how to address it. So that really stood out, the emotional and psychological abuse as being a primary concern for women. Another aspect that we saw respondents report were concerns about a lack of accountability for people who commit violence, and that was a range of physical, sexual abuse, that kind of broad range of violence. That there's a primary concern just about a lack of social but also criminal justice response to violence, and that's something we know our city, our county, our state, our country is attempting to work on, but that continues to be a primary concern. We would ask people if they would choose like lack of access to services related to violence, if they could give us more detail about that. They were prompted, if they took the online version, like, can you tell us a little more about that? And some of the primary things that respondents reported were being worried that they wouldn't be believed, not knowing who to go to for help, or fear of community response to disclosing, being afraid that they would lose support or something like that. So that really has informed a lot of the work we do with Voices of Hope, the work we do with Friendship Home. I made a separate report for Voices of Hope for people who had indicated that this was a primary concern for them, just to help them with their grant writing and the work that they do in the community as well.
And one last area that I want to mention, because I think this probably relates as much to you, you, and that is that housing ticked up much higher this time. Concerns about housing, being able to find affordable housing, and particularly, I think, a little bit more in the responses area of discrimination about housing. We did, some of you may know that we have a women's health program that we do here at the LNK Health Channel. And we did a whole program on discrimination that happens within our community related to housing. And women report more discrimination related to housing than men. And that often has to do with their family situation, in the sense that pregnancy and having small children and that kind of thing. So housing was a higher priority this time as far as what people responded to. Well, we've taken a lot of your time, but we wanted to have a chance to formally mention all these different areas. We do a lot of programming based on the results for this. And so, like I said, we have a women's health program, which we do. We have many partnerships, and one of the things that is our strength is the partnerships that we have with the groups, YWCA and all the different women's organizations around town, and we appreciate that support. And we certainly appreciate the support of the mayor.
And if you would like access to any of the, like I said, we have the different reports built by age, by education level, by race, ethnicity, and I'm working on the geographic profile ones as well. So if you would like access to that, please let us know. We will make that available to you easily.
Yeah, exactly. Is there anything else that we can answer really quickly?
Yeah.
I'd be interested in when you finish your zip code analysis, also, hopefully you would be able to include in those results the ratio of like how many per thousand residents in that zip code area responded. to see if you're
I would be
getting
able to figure that
See
out.
if you're getting an actual representative
Absolutely.
sample, or if there's
Yeah.
some areas that are underrepresented in this study, and others areas that are overrepresented.
And that was the thing that was hard because we didn't have funding, and so we weren't able to do random sampling, and so we did
Okay.
really proposive sampling because we knew based on census data, like here's what race looked like, here's what age looked like, here's what education looked like. So we made sure like if we were low in a particular age range, okay, we need to reach out to aging partners, or we need to,
Yeah,
so we
right.
were targeted in our sampling, but that means that, like you say, we're not gonna necessarily have a good random sampling, but the zip code profiling is gonna help us quite a bit, because then we'll be able to tell, like, we need to find out more from this region of town, or from
But I
this
will
area.
have to say that we were very pleased with the way that things turned out
Yeah.
as far as representative in age groups, representative in ethnicity, educational attainment. We really actually ended up with a group that was pretty representative numbers-wise in that regard.
But
We
I'll find
don't
out
know
the zip
yet
codes
about
pretty soon.
geographically. Tammy, did you have a question?
I did, Kathy. So I was actually surprised that housing wasn't even higher, so I'm not familiar with your previous study. Could you talk a little bit more about that as it relates to
Well,
women
again,
and-
I think a little bit has to do, well, I think a lot of it has to do with the cost of housing and being able to find appropriate housing within someone's income level. Okay, those were some of the answers that we had, and I don't know if
Some
do you
more of
want
the
to
qual-
answer
yeah,
that?
there were we saw a slight jump. So housing ranked, let's see, we had 20% of the sample ranked housing in 2012. It
It
went
was
up
5%, 6%, 6.5%.
Yeah, so it went up, but one of the things that's so informative from the qualitative responses were particularly for respondents who were in rental situations, that there were concerns about upkeep, safety. There, of our sample of 1,100, there were like 2 or 3 who wrote that they had experiences where landlords had entered their property without the 24-hour, like without the notice, and that kind of feeling kind of unsafe as women, that there's someone in their apartment when they showed up. But concerns about like plumbing issues not being addressed quickly, rodent or insect infestations not being addressed quickly. So there were concerns about that. But again, it was a subset within those who had given us more comments. But affordability was
Definitely the
was a
highest.
concern. Mhm.
Was accessibility part of that as well? That's okay if I'd be curious.
Yeah,
just
it's.
just some of the
I don't know,
comment
I don't
we-
remember
We
specifically
didn't
about
have like
accessibility.
access, we did, location, affordability, that, and then, we put insecurity and homelessness together, because that, seemed intuitive to us that they would be put together, but we didn't have anything specifically about accessibility.
Okay, that's good. No, I appreciate that.
But we can always go through qualitative responses to see if there's anything more specific about that. That's something that we
It's
can
all
do.
good.
Sure.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Thank you.
Again, we really appreciate your time and wanted to be able to have a chance to formally give you this information and be glad to follow up if you just want to email us or let us know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. Okay.
Kill 5 minutes, come back and do it again?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
How are you doing?
You're not- how are you?